Radio Wales Rewind. Listen on BBC Sounds.
The BBC began broadcasting in Wales from a small radio studio in Cardiff in 1923, and the rest, as they say, is history. In this programme from 1948, we take in some of that early history, exploring the BBC's first 25 years. I'm Huw Stephens, and this is Radio Comes to Wales.
February the 13th, 1923.
Hello. This is 5WA, the Cardiff station of the British Broadcasting Company calling. 5WA calling.
It was a Tuesday. The newspapers revealed a world curiously like our own.
Distress in Greece.
France adamant about the Ruhr.
Trouble in the British zone of Germany.
Serious housing shortage.
The sensation of the moment was the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb at Luxor. But in the Welsh newspapers, even this shrank to a single column on that Tuesday 25 years ago. The coming of radio to Wales was heralded with a fanfare of 2 full pages. But it was significant that both pages were framed with large-scale advertisements of radio sets.
First-class crystal set. Compete with 1 pair of outstanding headphones, 12 guineas.
Revolutionary 4-valve receiving set, including 2 pairs of super-quality headphones, 35 guineas. This does not include batteries and BBC tariff.
BBC? Unless you're careful, some listeners will think those letters mean what they do today.
Well, so that there should be no mistake, let's listen to the original call sign again.
Hello. This is 5WA, the Cardiff station of the British Broadcasting Company calling.
That's it. British Broadcasting Company. Company, not corporation. It was the wireless trade that gave the world broadcasting, not any government.
I said the advertisements were significant.
That was the trouble from the very beginning. The wireless trade was not concerned with what was broadcast, nor to whom. All it wanted was lots of people listening.
What was wrong with that?
Scientists are always the same. They discover gunpowder, poison gas, and atom bombs, and preen themselves on their cleverness with no thought of the results.
And rightly so. They're not responsible for man's use of their discoveries.
What's all this got to do with radio?
It's in the same class of dangerous discoveries. It can paralyze people's minds as surely as the atom bomb can destroy their bodies. It has made the word propaganda the most sinister in the vocabulary. It can pander to the cheapest in people's taste, so that all culture is sapped away. In its early years in Wales, it was a menace to our national life. After it had been going for 4 years, Professor W.J. Griffith said that it had done more to anglicise Wales than any other movement in the last 150 years.
Yes, I admit there's something in what you say, but there's another side to the story of those early years, too. It was a long time before Wales woke up to the significance of radio, and she gave little thanks to the pioneers for their donkey work. She did little to help the early beginnings, but once radio was an established success, she had enough to say. The early years were all experimental. The fact of broadcasting was the important thing. The body of listeners had to be built up, and so stations were placed in the populous centres. Cardiff was the first station in the West.
There you go again. The West. They even developed the absurdity of coupling both sides of the Bristol Channel as the Western region.
That certainly was asking for trouble, and the trouble came and mounted through the years. It's interesting to speculate about the placing of the first station at Cardiff. Did they foresee the future at all?
After we've got stations at Birmingham, Manchester, and Newcastle, the next one must clearly be somewhere in the southwest.
The place is obvious. Bristol.
I'm not so sure.
What's the alternative?
Cardiff.
You're not serious. The population of Bristol is almost twice that of Cardiff.
My dear chap, you must get used to the fact that radio doesn't stop at city boundaries.
Oh, I don't.
I'm after the industrial hinterland of Cardiff, those crowded valleys. So far, we can't reach those from Bristol, but we can reach them, and Bristol, too, from Cardiff.
Yes, I see your point. One other argument in favour of Bristol occurs to me. Things are beginning to look a little black in the coal mining industry, and I rather think they're going to get much worse. If I'm right, they won't be able to afford many expensive wireless sets in Glamorgan.
That doesn't really affect the argument. Soon every schoolboy will be making a cat's whisker set. It won't cost them much. And taking the long view, it's far more important for us to get 100,000 listeners than to sell 100 expensive sets. Agreed?
Agreed.
Then it's Cardiff.
Yes, it's Cardiff.
So station 5WA came to Cardiff. The studio was housed in Castle Street above the old Castle Cinema. It was a small room, just 18 feet square, and the transmitter was in Eldon Road, in what had originally been a coal shed. For the first 15 months, the Castle Street studio was the only one in Cardiff, and it was often packed to suffocation. To make it soundproof, it was also made almost airproof. And during transmissions in the heat of summer, it became unbearable. Listeners often heard this announcement.
There will now be an interval of 5 minutes.
Little did the listeners realize that the interval was to enable suffocating artists to get a breath of fresh air. But the opening day was in February, so that summer heat did not add to the discomfort of the crowded studio. One of the artists who broadcast on the first day was Ronald Chivers.
I still remember vividly my first sight of the studio. It was very crowded, and the workman was still putting the finishing touches to the place. There was no proper microphone, only a lot of telephone receivers suspended from the ceiling. I was singing in the Carston Quartet, and I remember the four of us had a microphone each. The quartet must have looked funny on that first day, because the telephone receivers started to twist round when we sang into them. We had to chase round them like children on ducking apple night. The soloists were Mostyn Thomas. He sang the credo from Verdi's Otello, and Gladys Palmer. At the opening ceremony, the speeches were the important thing, and very good they were too. Lord Gainford spoke. He was the chairman of the BBC. Sir William Noble, he was a director. And Mr. Reith, as he was then, he was the general manager of the BBC. The Lord Mayor also spoke. He was Dr. Biggs. But the words I remember best were spoken to me on the way out by Will Carston. He said, "I wonder if anybody heard us. If they did, then we'd been making history." The next day I found out that many hundreds had heard us in Cardiff alone. Somehow or other, I had never thought of that opening night of an unseen audience. I was just conscious of the people in the studio. A few weeks later, I broadcast my first solo, and by that time I was thinking so much of the thousands who might be listening, I had a bad attack of mic fright.
It is thou who hast blighted the soul I loved, the delight and the joy of my being, whom I trusted, yet who vilely betrayed me thus, changing all the world's beauty for me into poisonous hate. Traitor vile, thou hast foully requited all the love that I gave thee, all the love of thy comrade and friend.
Of one thing, Ronald Chivers can be certain. His audience tonight is much greater than when he first broadcast that solo. Some words of the Lord Mayor broadcast at the opening ceremony are worth recalling. Speaking of the results of the development of radio, he said,
"The standard of intelligence and artistic life will be raised. The highest form of culture will be taken into the homes of the poorest in the land, and the dwellers in the humblest homes will have the same opportunities as the denizens of Mayfair of hearing the polished periods of a Rosebery, the music of a Paderewski, or the notes of a Melba or a Tetrazzini."
The earliest programs were largely made up of music, but they had an item in those days which we've completely lost since. 6 to 6:30 and 9 to 9:30 interval.
And a jolly good item, too. Pity we've lost it. The trouble with broadcasting today is that there's far too much of it, and I don't mean that just as a cheap crack.
No, I quite agree. For a keen listener like myself, there's so much I want to listen to these days that it's almost a full-time job. I often think it would be a good thing if the BBC took a complete month's holiday every year, apart from giving us the news once a day.
Personally, I could do without that, too.
For the first months, broadcasting from 5WA was confined to the evening, with intervals. The hours were 5 to 10:30. The first programme ever to be broadcast from the Cardiff station was one that's been going on ever since, Children's Hour. For the staff in the early years, it was the most enjoyable part of the day. However harassed they might be by administrative difficulties, technical hitches, and listeners' criticisms, they could forget them all to become cheery aunts and uncles at 5:45 every evening. Radio begins to feel its age when it realizes that these kiddywinks are now themselves fathers and mothers.
But but I wonder if their children get the same thrill out of listening in as we did. They have grown up with it. To us, it was as surprising as a well-kept Christmas present. And I always think that earphones made us better listeners. You couldn't do anything else or hear anything else. You couldn't be distracted by the conversation of people in the room, those infuriating listeners who can't keep quiet. When the broadcast came to you through earphones, you felt it was aimed at you alone. Now so much of it blares unheeded from ill-adjusted loudspeakers. Yes, those aunts and uncles and cousins whose voices charmed my childhood ears are happy memories.
How many of you grown-up kiddywinks remember this voice?
Hello, children. Today we're going to take another wonderful trip on the magic carpet. This time we're going to ask you to take us to New York. And here it is waiting for us. It's going to be very crowded today because all the aunts and uncles and cousins are coming with us. Now, all aboard. That's right. Hold tight, everybody. We're off.
That was Auntie Bronwyn, and here she is to recall some memories.
They were happy days. Listeners and broadcasters were one big happy family then. We used to meet sometimes, too. For several years, the staff from Cardiff went across to the Sunshine Carnival at Grove Park Weston, and we used to broadcast Children's Hour from there. People came from all over the place to meet us. Birthday greetings was a favourite item in the programme. It became so popular that some days we had the hardest work in the world to get them all in. And we didn't forget the old folk either. When a silver or a golden wedding came along, we greeted them with a peal of bells. A host of memories come back to me. Memories of famous people. Robert Donat, for instance, used to come across from the New Theatre to give the children excerpts from Shakespeare. Memories of delightful colleagues, some of whom have become famous themselves.
Francis Worsley recalled some of his early trials and tribulations as a producer of radio plays.
My first production at Cardiff was 2 days after I first arrived and had been planned by my predecessor, Charles Brewer of scrapbook fame. I knew nothing whatever about radio production, which in any case in those days was rather primitive. There were none of the modern devices for fading in music or effects. If you wanted, for instance, to fade in marching feet, you didn't just put a record on and slowly turn a knob like you do today. You borrowed a platoon of soldiers from the local barracks, hung a microphone in the yard, and when the moment came in the script, a handkerchief was waved out of the window and the boys marched past. It was a nice piece of realism. When we wanted the walls of Jericho to fall down, we built a wall of real bricks out of a pile of real bricks in the corridor, and we pushed it down. All the effects in those days, of course, were done in the studio, usually by the actors or by Gilbert. Dear Gilbert. He used to be the night stenographer and later became the chief clerk. How well I remember him galloping into the studio with a typewriter wanted for an office scene and falling headlong into a bath of water, standing there ready to become the River Taff. We worked at tremendous pressure in those days, and I've known an occasion when the last part of a show was actually being typed when the first part was on the air.
I'm Huw Stephens, and you're listening to Radio Comes to Wales, a programme from the archives exploring the BBC's first 25 years in Wales.
When listeners in Wales are asked to recall programmes from the past, it's surprising how many of them mention the Di and Horace plays from Children's Hour, and they were far from being children when they heard them. Men hurried home from work to listen to them as eagerly as the children today listen to Dick Barton. It's an amusing situation to have adults enthusiastic about Children's Hour and children waiting impatiently for evening programmes. How many listeners remember this voice from the past?
My name is Olion. I come from a planet 40 million miles from your Earth, from what you call Mars. 1 hour ago, you laid instrument to Ollion's side, seeking my heart. Found no heart, no breath, yet I lived, withdrawn into myself.
But by the time we'd come to the man from Mars, radio was no longer an infant. It had become a strapping lad, running and jumping all over the place with great energy. Radio drama, in particular, was exulting in a multiplicity of effects, like a boy given a magnificent box of conjuring tricks for a Christmas present. Now that the boy is a full-grown man, he tends to despise the box of tricks and to rely on simplicity and the power of the spoken word itself. Nobody is more aware of these changes than the radio actor, especially those that have been on the air from the very beginning, like Sidney Evans.
Everything's changed since those early days. Then radio acting was a grand lark. We all thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. It's still good fun, but we realize now that successful radio acting requires a degree of technical skill undreamed of in 1923. Oh, and the plays too have changed. In the beginning, we didn't have plays specially written for radio. We cut our teeth on the classics, and we had the audacity to tackle them without any rehearsal. During one period in the first year, we did a play by Shakespeare each week. We received our books about 4 days before the show, and then we met an hour before we went on the air, just to go through the salient points and check the cuts. You can imagine that the books often looked a confusing mess. I shall never forget what happened when we did A Midsummer Night's Dream. I had to open a particular scene, and so away I started. Suddenly, I realized the rest of the cast did not know where I'd begun. And while they were frantically turning over pages and straining to have a look at my book, I tried my best to keep things going by playing all the parts in different voices. But this was too much for the cast. Somebody began to laugh, and they all caught it. There was nothing for it but to stop and have our laugh out. Well, then we pulled ourselves together, found the right place, and started all over again. Even to think of such a possibility today makes one shudder.
One of the most difficult problems in radio is to find out what the listener likes. If you don't like a play or a film, you simply keep away from it. But there's no such quick box office test for popularity in radio. Now we have the listener research panel to guide us. But in the beginning, the BBC had to grope its way gingerly through unknown country. Of course, there were always the unsolicited letters. Here are extracts from two published in the press on the same day in 1927. Still Smiling wrote,
The cheery Cardiff music programmes have been to me a welcome relief from London chamber music. Personally, I should like to hear more local programmes and less London.
But Tu Valva wrote,
The Cardiff radio music programmes are only suitable for such occasions as burying the dead or accompaniments for lamentations after terrible earthquakes. Let the man who compiles the music programmes have a stiff whiskey and soda before he starts. I'll pay.
From the very first day of broadcasting, music was the mainstay of programmes. At 6:30 p.m. on that February the 13th, so long ago, the station orchestra proudly played itself in with the entry of the Gladiators. A delightfully ironic reminder that every time we broadcast, we throw ourselves to the lions. Yes, but he didn't sound a bit like that, really, because the so-called orchestra consisted of only 5 players. The studio wasn't big enough for any more. Such light classical music was a safe bet. But what about music outside the safe area? Very tentatively, the Cardiff station began to test public reaction to syncopation. Wasn't it something to be danced to and not merely listened to? Sidney Lewis was one of the guinea pigs used in the very earliest tests. He was a well-known amateur pianist.
It was my dance band that was used as the guinea pig. There were 5 of us, all amateurs. A medical student played the drums, the American vice consul the saxophone, a tram conductor the trumpet, a clerk the violin, a storekeeper the trombone, and I, of course, played the piano. Oh, by the way, I was a bank clerk. 5WA had been broadcasting for 3 months when we were first invited to give an hour of dance music. As you've been told, the studio was almost hermetically sealed to keep out the noise of the street, and the night was warm and sultry. The studio was unbearably hot, and it got worse. As the program proceeded, we began to shed our garments, and before we'd finished, we were all stripped to the waist. My other recollection of that night shows clearly the happy-go-lucky atmosphere of broadcasting in those days. The station director loathed syncopated music, and to have to stay with it for a whole hour in a studio that was like a Turkish bath was more than he could stand. When we arrived, he greeted us something like this: "I suppose you are the jazz band. Well, here's the studio. Please announce each item before you play it, and at the end of your program, say good night to the listeners and tell them that 5WA is closing down." With that, he disappeared, and we didn't see him again. What a chance he gave to a bunch of imaginative young men out for a lark. But we were too keen on the job in hand to take advantage of it. Yet the opportunity was too good to miss altogether. When I was giving the closing announcement, I did slip in a special good night to my mother, who was listening at the end of the cat's whisker at home. A change came over Station 5WA when the studio moved to Park Place. It began to acquire its present professional polish. I felt the difference instinctively, and it gave me my first horrible experience of mic fright. It was in a program called Music Through the Ages. I had to represent modern times with 2 syncopated piano solos. I knew them so well that I didn't bother to take the music along. The announcer introduced my first number and left the studio. I lifted my hands to play and found that I had completely forgotten the opening bars. I was in a panic. Perspiration was streaming down my face. My hands were playing something, but I had no control over them, nor did the music make any sense to me. I felt it must be a series of hideous discords. After what seemed like a lifetime, I stopped playing. The announcer reappeared. I was about to mumble apologies, and to my amazement and infinite relief, he lifted his 2 thumbs and smiled approval. That was nearly 24 years ago, but it is more vivid to me than many things that happened only yesterday. I wonder if I could remember the number now.
People may get very heated about the respective merits of chamber music and jazz, but the broadcasting of any type of music is comparatively harmless. Gradually, it began to be discovered that radio had other uses than to provide a more or less pleasant background to chatter at the supper table. It was a Welshman that first exploited to the full its power for popular education, Sir Walford Davies.
And 2 of the parts, however many there were, should behave in this manner. One should approach the final of the mode from above, and the other should approach it from below at the interval of, don't be bothered about interval, it only means the distance between the notes on the piano, at the experience which we call a major 6th or a minor 3rd. Now, I'm sure as I play that, you're all used to it, because it presently became, and brass bands do it, and the Salvation Army do it, and as for jazz,
Radio began to invade other fields. It could turn the living room into a classroom, a theatre, a football field, a boxing ring, and a church. In 1927, the British Broadcasting Corporation was established, and this increased the demand for a separate broadcasting station for Wales. In that year was published the report of the Departmental Committee on Welsh in Education and Life. It stated that nothing short of the full utilization of Welsh in broadcasting, by whatever means this may be effected, will meet the case. And this gave rise to lively argument. On November the 30th, 1928, the agitation was brought to a head when a deputation from the Council of the University of Wales was received by the chief officials of the BBC in London. Sir John Reith agreed that a separate station for Wales was desirable, but pointed out the technical difficulties. And this was the position for the next few years. Protests and resolutions met by restatement of the technical difficulties. Meanwhile, the Bristol newspapers were equally agitated.
Services from obscure Welsh chapels are regularly broadcast from Daventry to the whole nation on Sunday evenings. This is a religious scandal, and there is not the slightest justification for it. The truth is, the West is weary of Wales. The West is not interested in Wales. The West wants wireless home rule.
Well, could you blame us?
Of course not. The whole position was impossible.
I must confess that when I was enjoying the Welsh service from Daventry, I never thought about the millions in England to whom it was double Dutch.
It seems to me that, considering the technical difficulties, Wales did pretty well, and she had fewer licenses in proportion to her population than the rest of the British Isles. In 1931, her percentage was 5.5, but that of the whole country was 8.6. One county in Wales had only 67 licenses.
But when we had a station of our own, the licensing soon went up.
It wasn't only Welshmen that were pleading for their own station. The West Country was, too. I began to feel sorry for the officials in Broadcasting House, London. One day, they'd have to deal with a deputation of Welsh MPs asking for more Welsh, and the next with a deputation of West Country MPs asking for less Welsh. But it was the Welsh that won. Bit by bit, they gained more and more time on the air and more concessions.
A bulletin of news in Welsh will be given each weekday, starting on January the 1st, 1934, at 10:30 p.m.
By the middle of 1934, the leading article in a Bristol paper said...
Really? This monopolizing of West regional radio programs by Welsh interests has become quite intolerable. Examine carefully this week's programs. There are 19 items of Welsh interest and only 2 from the English side of the channel. In effect, there is practically no West regional now.
At last, in the autumn of 1935, the inevitable happened. The West region and Wales were separated, though they had to continue to share a wavelength for another 2 years. As a result of the campaign during the years, a few Welsh-speaking men had been appointed to the staffs at Cardiff and Swansea. But now, 8 additional Welsh-speaking people were appointed to important posts. Before the end of the year, the Bangor studio was opened. At long last, all Wales could hear its own programmes.
Radio Comes to Wales, a fascinating programme from 1948, a window into the demands of those very early days of live radio broadcasting. Things have certainly changed. That's it for this episode of Radio Wales Rewind, celebrating programmes from the past. Don't forget, you can listen again via the BBC Sounds app.
BBC Radio Wales.